93 million Americans are living a lie. The home you're living in could be evidence for more and theft spanning half a billion acres. The National Archives has a page about the Homestead Act of 1862. This isn't some fringe conspiracy blog or a corner of the dark web. This is the official record of the United States government. And on that page lies a single sentence that most Americans have never been taught in school. It says that of the 500 million acres dispersed between 1,862 and 1,904, only 80 million went to homesteaders. Let that sink in. Do the math. 420 million acres of American land went somewhere other than American families. It didn't go to the struggling farmers Lincoln promised a fair chance. It went to speculators, cattlemen, miners, lumber titans, and the railroads. 84% of the largest land giveaway in human history missed its target. And that is the government test a number on its own website. Today, approximately 93 million Americans are direct descendants of homesteaders. That means 1 in 4 people alive in this country trace their family wealth and their starting point back to this single law. But if the records show that the vast majority of that land was diverted before it ever reached the people, what actually happened? When you start pulling at that thread, what unravels is something far more systematic than simple fraud. There was a matrix, a calculated error. The Homestead Act was designed to fail, and the evidence isn't hidden. It is sitting right in front of us, waiting for someone to ask why. Why was the law framed so ambiguously that it invited corruption? Why were the records documenting this massive transfer of wealth conveniently destroyed? You are standing on a crime scene that spans half a billion acres, and it's time we look at the deed. The story we were sold is beautiful. Lincoln signs a law on May 20th, 1862. Any citizen can claim 160 acres of public land, work it for 5 years, and it is yours for an $18 filing fee. It was the ultimate promise of democracy. Former slaves could file claims. Immigrants could file claims. Women heading households could own land for the first time in history. We see the black and white photos of rugged families in front of sod houses and we feel a sense of pride. But while the public was focused on the 80 million acres given to those families, a silent machinery was moving 175 million acres to the railroad corporations. In the span of just 6 weeks, in the summer of 1862, Lincoln signed 3 laws that redistributed more territory than most world wars. The Homestead Act gave the ordinary people the moral cover, but the Pacific Railroad Act and the Memorial Land Grant Act gave the corporations and institutions the actual land. The railroads didn't just get rights of way, they got gifts of territory larger than the state of Texas. And then they turned around and sold that free land back to the very settlers who were supposed to get it for nothing. They opened recruitment offices in Europe, promising a paradise that they had already monopolized. It was a bait and switch on a continental scale. The General Land Office, the agency responsible for preventing fraud, was deliberately underfunded. It couldn't hire enough investigators to cover its scattered local offices across the entire western frontier. The investigators it did employ were, in the archive's own words, often susceptible to bribery, and the loopholes were built right into the text. The law required homesteaders to build a 12 by 14 dwelling on their claim, but the drafters never specified feet or inches. Speculators built miniature wooden boxes 12 inches by 14 inches, set them on a patch of dirt, and filed claims on 160 acres. The law also allowed anyone to skip the 5-year residency requirement by paying $1.25 per acre after just 6 months. Speculators used this constantly. They would file a claim, wait 6 months, pay $200, and flip the land for a massive profit. Instead of creating a nation of independent farmers, the Homestead Act unleashed a fierce competition for land to resell, in which influential speculators always came out on top. And the Memorial Act did the exact same thing for universities. It granted each state 30,000 acres per congressional representative to fund colleges. Over 10.7 million of those acres were expropriated directly from the lands of more than 250 indigenous nations. Cornell University alone received nearly 1 million acres taken from 230 different tribal nations across 15 states. But you cannot just redistribute land unless you first deal with the people already living on it. This is where the story turns from bureaucratic failure to a calculated error. Enter the Doors Act of 1887. On its surface, it was supposedly designed to help Native Americans by giving them individual land ownership. Each head of household received 160 acres, exactly the same number as the Homestead Act. That was not a coincidence, because everything left over, every single acre not allotted to an individual, was immediately declared surplus and open to white settlers. In 1887, Native Americans held 138 million acres of land. By 1934, when the policy finally ended, they held just 48 million. 90 million acres vanished. Two-thirds of their entire territory was wiped off the map. The mechanism was elegant and devastating. After the trust period expired, the land became subject to state and local property taxes. Most native families had no cash income and no experience with the newly imposed tax system. They could not pay. So the land went to tax auction, where white buyers were literally waiting in line for the properties to go into forfeit. The Dawes Act created a system called checkerboarding, where native parcels were fractured and split up across different counties, making it impossible for tribes to manage their own land. It was a logistical nightmare by design. You cannot just take people less land permanently unless you also break the chain that connects them to it. In 1879, US cavalry captain named Richard Henry Pratt opened a school in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. His philosophy, stated publicly at a national conference, was 7 words long: kill the Indian in him and save the man. Children as young as 5 were taken from their families. Their hair was cut, their names were replaced, and they were forbidden from speaking their own languages. Between 1819 and 1969, the federal government operated or supported 408 boarding schools across 37 states. The 2022 Department of Interior investigation identified burial sites at more than 53 of these schools. The initial report documented over 500 child deaths. When you start researching the Homestead Act, you expect to find a story about land fraud and political corruption. You do not expect to find a parallel system designed to remove children from the exact same communities whose land was being taken. But the timeline does not lie. The Dawes Act broke up the reservations in 1887. The boarding school system was expanding through the 1880s and 1890s. The Homestead Act was delivering the seized land to new claimants. The same government, the same decades, the same people on the receiving end. And then there is Oklahoma. The Cherokee had been forced from their eastern homelands on the Trail of Tears. The survivors were promised their new territory as long as the grass grows and the water runs. But by 1893, the government was done waiting. On September 16, 1893, a rifle shot cracked across the prairie at high noon. Over 100,000 people surged forward to claim pieces of 6 million acres of Cherokee outlet land. 42,000 homesteads were staked in a single afternoon. The government had purchased the land from the Cherokee for about $1.40 per acre after eliminating their cattle grazing leases by presidential proclamation. Decades later, the Indian Claims Commission ruled the sale had been conducted under duress and the land was undervalued. They awarded $14.7 million in compensation, but the land never came back. It never does. Each land one operated under the Homestead Act. Each one was the same mechanism: treaty land declared surplus, repackaged as American opportunity. There is one more piece to this puzzle, and it is the piece that I keep returning to: the 1890 census. It was the most detailed census ever conducted up to that point. It tracked immigration, property ownership, and family composition. It was also the first census to officially declare the American frontier closed. That declaration changed how America understood itself. And then it vanished. On January 10, 1921, a fire broke out in the basement of the Commerce Department building in Washington. About 25% of the 1890 census was destroyed outright. Another 50% was damaged by water and smoke. The cause was never determined. Investigators considered a discarded cigarette, faulty wiring, and spontaneous combustion of sawdust. And here is what most people do not know. The 1890 census was the first for which the government did not require backup copies to be filed with local offices. One copy existed, and it was stored on pine shelves outside the fireproof vault next to a carpenter shop full of sawdust and wood shavings. The 1880 census was safely inside the vault. The 1900 census was in another building entirely. The 1890 census sat unprotected in the most flammable room in the building. The damaged records sat in the warehouse for over a decade. Then on February 20th, 1933, Herbert Hoover laid the cornerstone for the National Archives building. One day later, Congress authorized the destruction of the surviving 1890 census records. The building, meant to preserve America's records, was christened the exact same week the government destroyed the census that documented the single most transformative decade in American land ownership. 99.99% of the records are gone. 63 million people erased from that year. The decade of the doors allotments, the boarding schools, the Oklahoma and runs, and the massive railroad grants is the one decade you cannot see. Maybe this is all a coincidence. Maybe the Ford and the Homestead Act was just incompetence. Maybe the boarding schools were misguided idealism. Maybe the Census Fire was just bad luck. But I keep coming back to the math. 500 million acres distributed, 80 million to families. 420 million to corporations and speculators who still hold much of it today. The land under your feet has a story. Every deed traces back to a transfer. Every transfer traces back to a policy. The question is not whether this happened. The archives confirm it. The question is, why were we taught that it was a gift when the numbers say it was a matrix designed to steal a continent? Who really owns your country?